People are trickling in. I'll go ahead and get started. Thank you all for joining us for our Opus Connect webinar. Very happy that you all could make it. We are going to be discussing cybersecurity today. We have a very experienced and exciting panel for you, so looking forward to getting into that. My name is Lena Dobrier. I'm Director of Operations at Opus Connect. For those of you who are not familiar with Opus Connect, as we move to the next slide here, we are a lower middle and middle market M&A focused organization. We cater to private equity firms, investment bankers, lenders, independent sponsors, etc. We have chapters in Los Angeles, Chicago, and New York. And we do monthly events for each of those. Currently, we're doing them virtually. And we also do deal sourcing events around the nation. I think we're in 16 different markets. So if you're interested in learning a little bit more about us, feel free to reach out to my colleague, Jacob Zeffrin. His contact info is on the screen, and he'll be more than happy to answer any questions that you might have. Moving to the next slide, there will be, we might take live questions, live Q&A, or we might, and we'll also have a time at the end dedicated to Q&A. So if you look at the bottom of your screen, excuse me, you'll see an area where you can pose your questions. So feel free as they come to mind to just type them in there, and our panelists and our moderator will field those as they see fit. You know, these events would not be possible without the support of our sponsors. So we definitely want to give them the opportunity to say a few words for those who are here. I'm not sure if anyone from Baker Tilly is in the audience. It doesn't look like it. If you are, raise your hand. It's next to the Q&A, and I will unmute you, but I don't see you. So I just want to acknowledge them. They've been a longtime supporter of our New York chapter and our Chicago chapter, so we thank them. And we'll move on to the next one. Ice Miller. We have a panelist from Ice Miller today who's going to be speaking about cybersecurity, but maybe Guillermo, do you want to say a few words quickly just to introduce the firm?
Thank you, Lena. Yes, thank you everyone very much for joining us today. Ice Miller has been participating in Opus Connect, I think, for more than 7 years. My partners in New York, Tom Kesseglu and Chase Stewart, are always, I think, very active, and I'm very pleased to be able to be with you here today. As you know, we're a national firm here in the US with offices in New York, our main office in Indianapolis. I'm in the DC office, although I also am barred in New York. So thank you all very much for joining today. And I think we're going to have a great discussion with everyone on board.
Awesome. Thank you, Guillermo. We'll move to the next sponsor here, NFP. And I do believe Duncan is in the audience. So Duncan, I'm going to come to you and unmute you. And I'd love if you could introduce NFP and yourself and say a few words.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you for having us. And we're happy to be supporting Opus through sort of this transitional period we're all going through. NFP, for those who don't know, is a insurance broker and consultant focused on predominantly the middle market, and we've got 6,000 employees, over 300 offices, and you know, our main focus and our reason for partnering with Opus is to work with private equity firms and their portfolio companies on the insurance side across the full spectrum of insurance lines, working on due diligence and strategic projects, as well as transactional insurance policies like rep and warranty. But you know, right now deals are down, and so most of what we're doing is trying to be a thought leader and help answer as many questions and help clients and those in our network with any insurance related questions. So feel free to reach out if you have any. You know, we want to be here to support everyone to get through this together. So thank you and enjoy the event.
Thank you, Duncan. let's move to the next. I don't believe we have Bob Goldsmith on the line today, but I do definitely want to acknowledge them. BCMS, they've been a sponsor since I think the beginning. So we thank them for their continued support, and you can see contact information from Bob Goldsmith there. Visit their website, check them out, reach out if they can help you at all. Before we get to the good stuff, we have a couple questions for everyone in the audience. We want to know a few things from you. So you'll see a couple poll questions. We have 5 of them. We'll go through them fairly quickly. The first one is, we want to know how you heard about today's event. So you're going to see a question pop up on your screen. And if you can log your answer, we'll give everyone about 20 seconds or so, and then we'll move to the next. Cool. So it looks like our speakers have been helping to promote the event. We really appreciate that. And a lot of you heard from us, a little bit on LinkedIn, our sponsors. So again, appreciate that support. That's helpful for us to know internally. We'll move to the next question here. We want to know who you are. We have a few multiple choice questions. As you know, we cater to lower middle and middle market transactional professionals. So there might be a few of you in here. But also, given the topic, there could be an amount of others. So we'll see who we have in the audience today. And this is helpful for our panelists to understand who they're communicating with as well. Great. A lot of bankers. Awesome. Some service providers, some others, I assume in the cybersecurity space, some equity capital providers, and independent sponsors. So great, thank you for participating. Moving on to the next 3, these are more for our panelists and for us to understand, you know, how much of what we're talking about today do you know? How many of you guys have been affected by it? So this should go fairly quickly as well. Interesting. Give it another few seconds here. Okay, cool. So most of you know, some of you yes, perhaps some yeses that don't know. We'll get to that soon. Let's move on to the next question here. Have you lost any sensitive data or money as a result of a cybersecurity attack? Good, good to see a lot of no's here. A few yeses. Interesting. Okay, so it looks like majority are no's. Good. And to the next question here, which of the following technologies is your company using? You might not know, you might know, but let's see. Great. Firewalls, VPNs, good. Some encryption. Awesome. Okay, thank you guys for participating in that. That's super helpful for us to know and for our panelists to know as they move forward in the discussion. And without further ado, I'm gonna kick it over to our moderator today, an Opus Connect member, longtime supporter of ours, Peter FORMANEK of Young America Capital. Thank you for leading the discussion today. And I will bow out and let you take it from here.
Thank you so much, Lena. Yeah, so we have a great panel today. Several people are friends of mine, and certainly everybody is very well experienced in the cyberspace. Michael Hawkins is the CEO of Netizen Corp, which is a government and defense focused cybersecurity consultancy and software provider. Stephen Francesco is the chairman CEO of Cohere Cyber, which is a vertically integrated 360 support managed service provider and MSSP. David ROSSELL is the Managing Director of Security and Consulting Services at Entiva, which is a mid-sized managed service provider in a portfolio company of Southfield, for those of you that know Southfield. Guillermo Christensen is a partner, data security and privacy consultant and expert in the white collar defense group at Ice Miller, which is a law firm, global law firm. And he was previously at the CIA and other lettered agencies within the government, and has got a great wealth of experience. So that's a brief overview on who we have on the panel today. We're going to jump right into some case studies in order to try to get you excited about how you can safely work from home. And so the purpose of the webinar is to educate everybody on the best practices within the remote work or teleworking space, and do it in a way that will not harm yourself or your organizations. So we could jump to the next slide. So I'd like to turn it over to David, who is going to give us our first case study, and then we're going to have a interactive set of communication with the panel.
Great, thanks, Peter. This case study actually arose only about a month ago, maybe a little less, where we had a client of ours that was a think tank based here in DC, very prominent organization that's frequently targeted by nation states around the globe that don't like some of the things that they say. And that organization has, because of remote work constraints, has a very active VPN connection that its employees connect to. And what we found a few weeks ago was that an attacker had harvested names off of the organization's website, and essentially went through and culled names from articles that were published on the website, the staff list, anywhere that it could find a name. It created plausible usernames for them, and then it tried those usernames in sequence to log into the organization's website. And this is a real security risk for a lot of organizations, especially those who haven't had a VPN solution for very long, and maybe who haven't secured it properly. But in this case, we had taken some measures that prevented these password guessing attacks from succeeding. We had implemented multi-factor authentication, known in the industry as MFA, on the VPN, so that the attackers, even if they had gotten a password right, would not have been able to log in successfully because they wouldn't have had that second factor. The second thing that we had done was we were monitoring the VPN solution. We were monitoring the firewall so that we were aware of the attack happening. We were aware of the IP address that the attackers were using to conduct this, and we were able to respond pretty quickly and block the access. So the key takeaways here, without going into too much technical detail, is multi-factor authentication is absolutely critical to safeguarding your remote connections. And you know, multi-factor authentication isn't completely unhackable by any means, but it's a really, really important first security step. And then the next piece is that you definitely have to monitor what's going on in your system so that you're aware when attacks do happen, so that you can take steps to mitigate them.
David, Guillermo here. I think the other interesting point to note about this is, as you started off mentioning that the target was a think tank, right? And most of us, yep, whether in New York or in DC, we know that think tanks are basically set up to put most of their stuff out in public. They're putting out, you know, all these white papers and all these things. So you're asking yourself, as I did years ago when I had something similar happen, why would a nation state go and target a think tank, right? And it's for the same reason, right, that they target a lot of our companies. And it's because there's information that isn't public, or sometimes It's because they get access to somebody. Most of these think tanks have, I'm a member of the Council on Foreign Relations in New York. They have, every ex-State Department, CIA director, et cetera, in there. If you can go in, you can perhaps impersonate somebody, send an email to someone else with a malicious link, with some phishing attack, and it comes from somebody that they think they know, you've managed to bypass a lot of the defenses that we're naturally, hopefully, putting in place. So it's not always the information itself that's of interest, but the people who are there that are a target. And I think this is a really good example of this. And in fact, the Chinese, for example, have targeted probably every think tank in DC or New York at some point because of that kind of an attack. So think also when you think of the threat here, not just being that information that's in a company or an entity's holdings, but the people, often the treasure of these organizations is that access that they can provide you to someone else.
That's a really great observation, and we've seen in other attacks with this organization that that's exactly what was going on. You had actors likely from, say, North Korea who are coming in and were trying to use individuals from this organization as stepping stones to others. Absolutely.
So why don't we jump to the next panel, case study?
Really quick, I'm sorry to interrupt. David, can you give us just a slightly fuller introduction on yourself and your background and your company, and then we'll move on to the next one. And if every panelist could do the same, I think that will be helpful. I know Peter gave an introduction, but if you could reintroduce yourselves, that'd be awesome.
Sure. My name is David Rossell. I am the director of the security and consulting practice at Antiva Inc. Antiva is a national managed IT services provider and managed security services provider based out of McLean, Virginia. We are one of the 50 largest IT services providers, commercial providers in the country. We're a member of the Southfield portfolio, and we're have offices also in Chicago, Southern California, New York City, and Florida and West Virginia.
Wonderful, thank you. So,
do we want to jump to the next slide?
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay. Steve, go ahead.
All right, I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Steve Francesco. I'm the chairman and CEO of Cohere Cybersecurity. Been in business about 15 years, was a true startup. Our first month's billing was about $11, and we've grown from there. And we have staying power. Most of our clients, more than half our base, is financial firms. We're on the security side. We do a lot of private equity groups, small broker dealers, trading firms, usually at least multi-office, if not multinational. Our network extends through Europe and South America, and we have a presence in Toronto. What we found out during this pandemic is most of the business continuity plans, I hate to admit this, the ones we put together were all stress tested, and we found deficiencies in how people work from home. A lot of what we saw out there was systems that were outdated with patches. Many of them couldn't run the business applications being sought after, and a lot of them had viruses and malware embedded within the systems. The first weeks of this pandemic were our worst of times. We worked through the evenings, days, and weekends trying to basically fill voids. And what we found out at the end of the day is nothing was really put together for a prolonged outage as we have now. We ended up deploying agents and putting some infrastructure on local machines to basically shore them up. But we always found ourselves with that last emergency of someone doing something wrong, dragging data from their home laptops onto their business machines and then spreading the infection throughout the network. Since then, we have a lot of policies, group policies enacted, making restrictions and making other lives miserable as ours, making them keep the data I can't even say it, my mouth, excuse me, between the two units. Right now, we probably have at any given time 1,000 or more VPN connections into us, probably as many during a peak of 3,000 to 5,000. And they are a nightmare to manage, as David said. We're always monitoring them for potential, what we consider infiltration.
Thank you, Steve. Michael Hawkins, maybe you could just share, what your experience has been relating to Steve's topic.
So a lot of it, the work from home stuff has been very interesting. We have a lot of defense work, a lot of defense contracts. We had customers on that side who absolutely swore that none of this could be done remotely, and they had the same sort of issues. If you're taking home defense information, especially when it deals with, some sensitive topics, not necessarily classified, but still sensitive information. So how do you keep that off a personal device, and how do you prevent the transmission from each personal device? And at the same time, how do you maintain equipment that's out in the field? And a lot of the things Steve talked about were kind of the things that the government focused on early on as well. The patching and upgrading systems, the monitoring, making sure, you have an asset plan and an asset list, and making sure that things are essentially dialing homes. You need to dial back into the VPN. You need to ensure that your machines are configured properly, certificates are installed, patches are upgraded, things like that. There was a lot that had to be done and put in place for a lot of our customers to be able to go remote like that. So, this was a huge part of that.
Hey, Peter, Guillermo here. If I could maybe just take a step back. If we think about it, the real challenge of this work from home environment right now is, first, you've got people pushing their employees working on their home computers rather than their business computers. So as Steve mentioned before, that means you're on a platform that hasn't been vetted, hasn't been managed, configured, updated the same way that you hope your business machines would be. The second is you're worried about your sensitive business data migrating from your business network into other networks. It could be the home computer, it could be OneDrive, it could be Dropbox, all kinds of things that become more likely to happen when you've got the networks coming together this way. Third, it's entirely possible your employees are going to be accessing your networks insecurely, right? They may need to go on a hotspot at the local Starbucks, or here we have public libraries, because their internet is not working well, or the kids are screaming in the background, and so the employee has to go somewhere else to get away from that sound. And then the other one that's really important is everybody's using new tools that they never used before, right? Like, for example, Zoom or any number of other collaborative tools, and how they're configured, how they're set up to run. Everybody's experimenting with this. And experimentation is a great opportunity to make mistakes, just as it is an opportunity to make great success. So those are the kinds of things that work from home brings into this. And then the last one, and I think this is the one that I'm particularly conscious of, which is the human factor, and is just the general level of anxiety, the chaos, the doing things differently that makes everyone not question something unusual the same way that they might have in the past. And that leads people to think, well, maybe IT is sending me this link to update my machine. Who knows? They've been sending me all this other stuff. Maybe this time I'll click it, and that's when something goes wrong. Or there's something else that they just don't expect. So those are my 5 big concerns that I see consistently across this work from home type environment.
Thank you, Guillermo. David, do you have anything to add there?
One of the things that we've been seeing recently, and this speaks to something that Guillermo said, was the huge spike in COVID-related phishing attacks. And that's been a really clear tactic on the part of your garden variety phishers, spammers, and then the really capable organizations that are larger, maybe associated with nation states. And anxiety has really negative cognitive effects. It affects people's decision making in negative documented ways. And anything that we can do as IT groups, as security groups, to reduce people's anxiety, to help people recognize what is normal and what is not, can go a long way towards, I mean, it's the humane thing to do, but it's also a really great cybersecurity initiative. And one of the things that we've been doing is just stepping up some of our phishing prevention training, you know, making sure that people understand things to look for, and, you know, again, not scaring people, making sure they know we're there to help, but also, you know, just repeating the message because that repetition is ultimately how people learn things.
Thank you, David. We have one question from the audience for Steve. Many home users do not have high-end routers capable of performing data control and security functions. Are you routing all remote traffic through your networks to perform the group policies and advanced protection, or what?
We actually extended their domain to their home computers. Many of the high-end users were already on the domain, and we extended policies to those systems as well, especially systems that we found that were getting attacked and they were having problems, and we put agents on there to clean them up, do the patch management. We also understood that a lot of the software for VPNs were outdated, and that was another big issue. Although their infrastructure was upgraded, their home infrastructure was never really touched until this pandemic emerged. So there was a lot going on in upgrading systems and reinstalling software, and then retraining and putting credentials out there. And some of them we've even extended. One of the things that David brought up was multi-factor authentication for some sensitive users.
Thank you, Steve. Can we go to the next slide, please? We have another question for David. Could you speak on password versus passwordless MFAs?
Sure. With multi-factor authentication, your best bet is always going to be to have some sort of physical token and not to use something that is texted to you via SMS or even necessarily a numerical code. The best way to go is to have a push application, and that can be something like Microsoft Authenticator or Duo or Okta. But text-based messaging or phone-based is always a poor choice, because those are some of the easiest methods of multi-factor authentication to circumvent.
Okay, great. And Guillermo, I'm going to hand it over to you for your slide. I look forward to hearing what you have to say about this topic. Thank
you. And just to give you a little bit of more background on me, I come at this from a couple of different angles. Before becoming a lawyer, as Peter mentioned, I was at the CIA for almost 15 years. And the work I did there fell both into the technology piece of this, but also, more importantly, the human factor. And that's one of the things that I want to stress, and you'll hear me saying this over and over again, and that is the technology here is usually the road on which the hackers, and that's a little bit of what I used to do, that's the road on which we will come in. But the people who open the doors or the people who don't close the doors behind them, they're people. They're human beings who either make mistakes or get manipulated by people who spend a lot of time figuring out how to manipulate them. And most of the good hackers, the ones that I've worked with and the ones that we've hunted, are excellent at hacking the human mind. They focus on something that you may have heard before called social engineering, and that's simply ways in which they can trick you. They're scam artists to some extent. Some of them are very effective. We've seen people do things as simple as calling up a phone helpline for an IT provider and having a recording of a kid crying in the background and pretending to be someone who's just trying to get into their account, or their boss is going to fire them. And that person on the other end just says, you know what, I'm going to help you. And boom, they're in like that. So you have to imagine that you're dealing with people who are in many ways criminally very, very imaginative. So the case study I put here, I used it for two reasons. One, because I think it's important for people to understand that the value of information may not be in your eyes. It may be in the eye of the attacker. and as we mentioned before on with these think tanks, sometimes it's information, sometimes it's the access. But there are a lot of people who just don't understand how valuable the information they have in their company, or how dangerous and risky it can be for them if it gets compromised. It could be because you end up losing personal information that is protected under the law, or market information that ends up causing other issues. In this case, what we had is a client operating internationally that knew from past experience that they were being hunted by malicious threat actors who were trying to collect all kinds of sensitive information for them. And they had decided that basically the only way to really deal with this was to have in-person meetings. So they would bring their team, their national team, to one location in the US to have the most sensitive meetings. An expensive, not a time-efficient way, but a way to be secure. And they would sweep the rooms like a lot of boards will do in public companies. Obviously, this is not working very well right now, and it wasn't going to work long-term. So what we did is we designed for them a system, a communication system that is able to operate with almost zero trust. And what I mean by that is, if one of their devices that we set up for them were to be lost or were to be stolen, you leave it in the hotel room, and we call it the maid attack, where the cleaning lady comes in and actually is an operative hired to steal the device, takes it away. That device has been hardened to make it very difficult, not impossible, but very difficult for somebody to get into it. And not only that, we rely on technologies that wipe the messages on an ongoing basis. They're called ephemeral data messaging applications, and they're very, very popular now and very effective. So after a certain period of time, there's nothing on that device that someone else could read. And we distributed these devices to their leadership, and then we trained them. And by training, I mean we train them not just on how to operate that particular application, but how to secure the device when they were using it in a hotel room, for example. Being conscious that a lot of hotel rooms, especially in places like China, they not only have microphones in the room, they're tapping all the internet connections, but they may also have hidden cameras. And one of the favorite reasons for doing that is when you're typing in that password on your phone, that hidden camera is recording that, and then they're using that in order to get into the phone when they steal it. So the key takeaway here is, especially for senior leadership teams, being able to speak in confidence, with a great deal of confidence that you're able to speak openly, is really important in crisis situations like the ones you're dealing in right now. You might be making market moving decisions. You might be dealing with something that could be very negative for the company if it were disclosed, embarrassing. Being able to speak openly and not have to talk in code or around things is extremely important. And then doing so in a way in which you know that it's not going to end up being leaked to a newspaper, journalist, or a criminal, or being on the dark web, this insidious thing that we hear so much about, is really important. But setting this up really requires understanding the need for confidence in confidentiality in your communications. So that's why this, I think, is an important takeaway for a lot of leadership teams out there right now.
Okay, we have a couple questions from the audience. For those who are not linked to VPNs of their organizations, such as independent workers, what do you recommend that people do to secure their own systems, especially users of Mac or iPhones? Could they be more secured in some ways? And then also related to that, Guillermo, is what alternatives to Zoom do you think are perhaps a more secure alternative than Zoom?
Yeah, absolutely. So one thing I will warn you about first is there are a lot of VPNs that you can use commercially. You can get them on your iPhone, on your iPad, on your Mac, on your Windows. Be very careful of those. The only ones that I recommend are the ones where you are actually paying for the service and getting some assurance that the information is going to be protected. The reason for that is very simple. What a VPN basically does, it's a virtual private network. It's as if we created a tunnel for you to be able to drive your data securely from your computer back to either the server or wherever the data is. And we create that tunnel by encryption. Well, if that tunnel goes to someone else, the person who provides that service, and over there they decrypt everything and then they record everything and they take it and then they pass it on to your computer, it's as if you had a spy right in the middle. It's called a man-in-the-middle attack, and it is devastating. a lot of these free VPNs, especially the ones that may be sourced out of China or Russia, that's exactly why they're free, because you are the product, right? You are the lunch that they're eating. So be very careful with those. If you Google good VPNs, commercial VPNs, you're going to get a whole bunch of recommendations. I won't throw out any here because I'm, just to avoid being affiliated with one solution or another, but there are a number of them that are very privacy conscious and therefore protect your data. As far as alternatives to Zoom, a couple that I will name because they're not in the business of making money, they're not for profits, but Signal, which is a company that was created by Open Whisper, excellent encryption, very high end, open source, so it's vetted by a lot of security specialists that can do video conferencing. I think it's very good. I think Skype and Microsoft Teams are better than Zoom right now. I suspect Zoom will get much better because they're putting together a security team, but those tend to be pretty good. The key is to make sure that all the endpoints, all the people on the call are authenticated in some way, and then that there's encryption. And that's why Zoom is still struggling with that. Understandably, they basically went from 0 to 60 in a half a second. So,
thank you. And then Steve, you do a lot of work for VoIP clients. Here's a question relating to remote telephony and call center solutions. Could you read that question and then answer it? Because it's pretty complex, but I thought it was a good question. And unmute your phone. Or Steve, you're on mute. Okay. David, maybe you could take
handle remote telephony for customer service and call center solutions.
Yes, sir. Please take it to tackle that question.
We took the path of building our own private network for both security reasons and performance. Although we have interconnects to the public networks like the internet, most of our clients that want quality of service and performance really use us on a private basis. We run a 10 gig network. We can interconnect with just about anyone, and on the public side, we use technologies like Redshift networks that not only monitor for fraud, but actually can encrypt calls. Right now, going out to call centers, we run a product that Cisco bought a few years back called BroadSoft, and our BroadSoft product allows us to do voice and video, and we can secure end-to-end if we're managing end-to-end, or they have a compatible system in the VoIP, and it will negotiate for a secure connection as well as for quality of service.
And related to that, there's another question now. Would you recommend going straight to the cloud for file/server storage as opposed to a VPN? We have been using Ignite with good results.
On my end?
Yes, please, Steve.
Yeah, I'm not a big public network advocate. I don't even advocate public clouds that much. Most of our clients really want the luxury of a private cloud or what we consider a hybrid between their location and our infrastructure. Our clients are again, a lot of financial firms we service, they're very security conscious. They worry about where their data is residing and who's managing it and who has access to it.
Peter, if I could, on cloud, I think one of the main lessons that I think we've learned in the security sector about cloud is almost 99.9% of the time, relying on a cloud solution is better than what we call on-premises, because most security teams are so overwhelmed, they just can't keep up. And if you can kind of offload some of that responsibility to a more centralized provider like the work that Steve does and others, you're coming way out ahead instead of hiring that one IT person who just can't do everything. But the key challenge with any cloud service, and it doesn't matter whether you're on the Microsoft cloud, the Amazon, or your own cloud that you roll yourself, is it has to be configured well and maintained. That configuration has to be maintained because in effect, any cloud by definition, is exposed to the whole world. It's not a closed network. It's designed for other people to get into it, whether it be through VPN connections or others. And so the doors, the gateways into that cloud data have to be maintained very well. And that's that configuration problem. And so when you read about these breaches about, Amazon web services being breached, it's not a problem up with Amazon. The problem is that someone didn't set something correctly. They left the keys to the encryption on an open server, or they did something else. And the hackers know these things because they get the same instruction manuals. A lot of them are experts in these services. They know exactly where to look for those problems.
Okay, great, thank you.
Yeah, Peter, one step further, a lot of the cloud, especially public cloud deployments, are done through third party. And once those firms leave, whether they go out of business, whether they stop supporting you, it's very difficult to maintain those apps because you don't know how it was put together. You don't know how it was executed. And there's really no roadmap for you to go any further. Smaller firms, it isn't bad, but the larger firms are struggling with this issue.
And then there's another question. What do you think of Google Sheets, Google Docs, and Google Forms? How secure is it?
It's pretty secure. I mean, a lot of folks use it as a default part of their Office network, as well as a replacement for their Office suite instead of going up the Microsoft products. There are people who will not, who aren't well adjusted to Microsoft.
Yeah, and I would say
with, I'm sorry, Guillermo, go ahead.
No, David, please go ahead.
The challenge with using Google Sheets and Google Docs is the same that we alluded to earlier with configuration. Google invests a lot in security, and their security is going to be better almost certainly than what you're using to protect your own equipment and your own infrastructure. But unless you're protecting access to those Google Docs appropriately, unless you're managing that access regularly and monitoring who's got access, that's where your security challenges come in. And it's really important not to look at cloud as a panacea, and not to think that cloud is more secure or less secure for that matter. It really comes down to how are you setting it up? How are you ensuring that people are proving properly that they are who they say they are? That is identity and access management. How are you limiting access appropriately within that application? That is, are you providing people with the lowest level of access that they need that's consistent with their ability to do their work? And then are you checking up on this periodically, preferably through some automated tool to make sure that everything is going as it's supposed to?
Yeah, I was going to just add to that real quick. So Google, a number of years ago, was one of the first to face a persistent threat from China. Their systems were hacked to an unbelievable extent. The Chinese put a lot of resources into doing that. And they began to put a lot of attention on security, and they came up with more and more interesting solutions. And in fact, one of the kind of the state-of-the-art solutions for the multi-factor authentication and password usage is something that Google rolled out throughout its network. And you can also use it on your own Gmail accounts. You probably can't see this very clearly, but it's a little device like this. And so these, instead of having to put in a code, this device protects every time I log into a website. It not only checks the password and the multi-factor, but it also checks that I'm going to the actual website where I want to go and not someone else's fake website. Once you have one of these installed, Google's experience was their phishing, their rate of phishing successful attacks went down to 0, according to their records. Obviously, I can't verify that, but they went down to by a tremendous extent because of that. This is something you can buy for not very much money. And most of the companies that we know who've put that into place have seen a lot of their security problems go away for a while. I say for a while because for every one of these, there's somebody out there that's going to figure out a way around it. It's a yin and yang game, and it doesn't stop. So
we had just had one participant recommended intermedia.net as a industrial strength video conferencing app, which is free until December 31st. It's much more secure than Zoom. So I'll just point that out. And then there was another question. Can Guillermo name a couple of reliable VPNs that he has implemented?
All right, I'll go ahead and give you some names. So PIA, Privacy Internet, I can't remember what the A stands for. PIA is very good. There's another one called NordVPN, NORD-VPN. And then Proton Mail, which some of you may know because of its high-end security, also has a VPN. Most of these, one of the reasons why they're very effective, and this actually ties into a question that someone else asked, they're based in countries where they have very strong privacy protection. So they're usually based in Germany or Switzerland, where it's very difficult for for the government to get access to the records. And if you're operating a VPN, that's a nice thing to have. It's not something, for example, if they were based in the Middle East or forgive, this, if it were based in China, pretty much anything that company has, is going to be accessible to the government. Obviously in the United States, you have national security letters and all kinds of judicial vehicles to be able to get to the data. So sometimes those are the ones. So NordVPN, Proton, PIA are all pretty good ones.
Great. And what is that piece of hardware that you pointed out to us, Guillermo?
So they're called, they go by several names. One is a FIDO key, and the other is a UTF key. And you can find them. Google actually will sell you their version, I think 2 keys for about $50. If you put your Gmail on it, you get upgraded to a service of security that's equivalent to what they would give you if you were a very prominent politician or someone who's likely to be targeted. And you get 2 because if you lose one, you're not going to get into your account very easily. So you have 2 and you keep 1 to the side. And basically every time you log into something, it's either in your computer or it's a Bluetooth connection. You hit a button, automatically authenticates you into that website. And people have been testing them for a long time. They're very effective. They're basically hardware tokens. It's what we used to use in the government in a different way. And they're extremely user-friendly, which is the other reason I like them. You don't have to worry about too much configuration. So
let's put Michael's slide if we can, and then we'll take some more questions.
Super.
Awesome.
Michael, go ahead.
All right. So I'm Mike Hawkins. I'm the CEO of Netizen. As a quick overview, we focus in cyber for a lot of federal defense customers, about 60% of our business. Last year, we were the fastest growing privately held cybersecurity company in the country, the second fastest growing veteran-owned company in the country. And we have a large commercial practice. We also have a couple products that we sell ourselves. A lot of what we talked about here, we've talked about a lot of technical controls and a lot of technical things that could help, reduce the impact of a breach or prevent a breach altogether. But when you're taking in the whole of things, you're talking about extending the perimeter of what was your IT shop into literally somebody's living room or, a Starbucks coffee shop up the road. And our defense customers especially struggled with that a lot. And so when you're talking about all this technology and things like that, it's great. But even the best security system in the world isn't going to prevent somebody from inside opening the door and leaving it open. So there's a lot of things that you have to do in order to maintain a level of security. And it's not always the shiny technical stuff that everybody likes to concentrate on. SIEM solutions are great, anomaly detection, that, all this artificial intelligence being built into things now. But documentation, compliance management, risk and vulnerability assessments, things like that are very critical. About 35% of the cybersecurity controls implemented and leveraged by federal customers, defense contractors, and even commercial companies is really documentation and process related, not necessarily technical. So especially if you have a company that's subject to, say, like PCI DSS for credit card processing, you have FINRA, SOX, SOC 2, even HIPAA. So many of the controls in those programs are literally documentation related, they're process related. Technology plays a key part, that's for sure, but you're extending your compliance boundaries into somebody's living room. What's the impact of that? And so what we do is we work with customers to come up with what's called risk-based cost-effective measures, especially, you know, with the audience being mostly in the financial industry, you understand risk-based. Everything's got a risk associated to it. What is your level of risk that you're willing to accept? What is the level of damage or impact to a particular risk that is, not necessarily acceptable, but, you can still get your job done without putting so many controls in place that it's absolutely impossible to work remote. And a lot of these kinds of things are considerations that our customers have taken into effect. And, these jobs that, a lot of people swore would never go remote, all of a sudden are remote. And I saw a recent, I believe it was Business Insider study recently that said about 29% of the jobs that are currently remote may not even come back to the office entirely. There may be either a majority remote component or they may stay remote. So this is not a thing that's going to go away anytime soon. This is going to expand. This is going to grow. It's going to keep going. So how are you keeping track of these things? How are you documenting your assets? How are you, checking what's in your environment now that you've extended your environment into somebody's personal space? So we work with a lot of customers on that, especially ones that have great compliance-focused programs. And a lot of it comes down to documentation. Okay, something happened. How do you respond to it? You need to have that incident response plan. Okay, where are all my assets and devices and things like that? You need to have all that documented in a system security plan. You can't just throw everybody out into the wind and just hope that, this shiny new SIEM tool that you just implemented from a great vendor the other day is going to just protect you against everything. So much of it comes down to putting into your employees, having them understand exactly what their responsibilities are, exactly what they are required to do, what their expectations are, especially when they're out in public working remote. And so much training comes down to that too. The defense industry in particular, there's about 40 or 50 hours a year of training that you have to take just to maintain your network access. Now, that might be extreme for a lot of commercial customers, but I've seen a lot of our commercial customers that just threw people out remote, didn't give any training or anything whatsoever. And it caused a bit of difficulty because the person behind the keyboard is ultimately going to be one of your major weaknesses. And the only way to really control that and to mitigate that risk is through process, documentation, and training. So technology important, absolutely. But there's other components to it. About 35 to 40% is going to be process related documentation and just setting and managing expectations of your workforce at the same time. So that's about all I had.
Okay, we also had another question relating to privacy concerns. And Michael, since you are the process and documentation expert and you deal with a lot with the military, could you talk about how they view privacy concerns with remote workers and what policies have you implemented in that regard?
Sure, absolutely. So a lot of our federal customers, for instance, we have a team down in Orlando, and they work with some sensitive systems, mostly modeling and simulation, and it's stuff that they were doing on site, and they were doing it at an NSA facility in Orlando that was behind about 4 or 5 different gates that you had to have, key card access to get into. You had to have an ID, visitor badge, the whole thing. All of a sudden, these people are working out of their houses now. So they implemented a number of things. First of all, they had to have mandatory training before they could work a sufficient amount of time remote. Second of all, they had to implement the monitoring technology needed to be in place to see what was going. There's a lot of digital rights management protections that the government invested in order to, classify and maintain the confidentiality, privacy of their information. So a lot of the stuff that's going out isn't necessarily classified, but it's taken as the whole, it's sensitive. And, it's enough information that another nation state competing against us could leverage it against us. And so they did everything. I mean, they configured special equipment for remote access. They actually made employees sign agreements saying that they could not work at a public location. They had to work out of their home. And if they didn't have sufficient network bandwidth, they were given cellular access devices that were secure. They worked specifically with a couple different cellular vendors. They got specially configured cellular network devices that they could access a secure network through and then perform their work. So that's some of the stuff they did.
Beautiful, beautiful. David, do you have any insights on that?
You know, like Mike was saying, really trying to have a very intentional cybersecurity training program is absolutely critical. And a lot of defense contractors, you know, already they have FSOs and they have the required annual training anyway. But oftentimes that kind of boils down to site security. And once a year does not provide you with enough proficiency in any kind of given measure. You know, it's like learning how to do CPR. You know, you get CPR training once and something bad happens and you need to do CPR and you're going to forget it all. If you retrain in CPR every 6 months or every year, eventually you get enough facility with it that when you're under stress, your body will do it, even if your brain is sort of freaking out. And that's really why you train. That's why you do things over and over again. And we need to roll into our traditional corporate training, HR training. We need to roll into that cybersecurity training.
Yeah, that's
whether you're a DoD contractor or not.
Yeah.
Sorry, I was going to say on the data privacy thing, the other thing I would just mention, and I think all of us here probably had this unfortunate experience. We do a lot of work advising companies on how to set up their data privacy programs to be compliant with whether it's the California statute or GDPR for the EU. You know, lawyers have had a field day with this stuff because it's very complicated. But the reality is one of the worst feelings you can have is you had a breach, you've lost a lot of information, your systems may have been down for a while, and then you realize that you also have to pick up the phone or send a letter to 15 state regulators to tell them that you lost the data of your employees or your customers. And then they get to notify them, and you then have to pay for identity theft protection. You may be in litigation, which is the worst thing of all. You know, it's bad enough dealing with the hackers. The plaintiff's lawyers are another problem altogether. But the data privacy is a big issue, and we're not seeing the government regulators in this area saying, hey, you know what, in this time of COVID-19, we're not going to enforce this stuff the same way. No, it's the opposite. They're saying, because we're using these digital tools so much, we want you to protect privacy even more. So we expect this to be another area where there's going to be a lot more attention. Thank
you so much. Some additional questions. Where do you see the best investment opportunities within the cyber industry, and what does this mean for IT investment opportunities for anybody that has some insights?
It's got to be in the tools for cyber because they're still in a very immature state. Still a lot of growth capability, still a lot of movement that can be done. But the worst part is everything that's built in the cyber arena is shared with all the nefarious characters out there, and they end up looking at workarounds. So it's a never-ending battle of plugging up the holes. But we see the tools because people are just too expensive.
I was going to say, it needs to say artificial intelligence, machine learning with quantum computing on the cover. Otherwise, it's not going to be worth a cent. No, just kidding. I actually think some of the best opportunities, and Stephen and I have looked at some of these and looked around, are in the intersection between the intelligence community, the defense sector, and the commercial space. This is, 30 years ago when I first got into this business, you were in one side or the other. You were not on both. And now that is coming together in a big way. And so I would say if it's got a good application in the black space and the internet and intelligence community space, it probably is going to have more of an application in the commercial space. And I would be looking for those, but those are really hard to figure out because by nature they've been in a classified environment, and sometimes it's not completely clear what these people are talking about.
Well, Steve, could you just describe how you built your SIEM? Because I think that's a very applicable software construction process that people would like to hear about.
Peter, myself?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, finding people was the biggest challenge in New York. There's a lot of smart people in New York, but not a lot of experience in cyber. And a lot of the major firms, what we found out, they outsource more for the optics than the substance. So it's been a challenge. We've actually recruited people both remotely. We've partnered with firms in the in the intelligence, what we consider the government circles. We've recruited out of Northern Virginia. We continue to look to recruit out of other parts of the US. It's hard to find qualified people, and I think we all struggle with it.
Yeah, no, but how did you build your SIEM software stack?
We built our SIM using what we consider the open source foundation, but we've retained people out of Northern Virginia to help us put the security and integration behind it. It was a team effort, and it took about 2 years to get complete, 2.5 years, but today we deployed it. It's very solid. We continue to keep it upgraded, and we have a good following with the product.
Thank you. And Michael, you have a software product that's very popular. I believe it's called Overwatch. Could you just give us an overview on that?
Sure, absolutely. So what we saw is a lot of technical tools. They focus on a technical audience. They focus on the frontline technicians that are working on stuff. Overwatch provides a level of compliance and governance visibility is what we call it to decision makers. So you have your boardroom, your C-suite, and a lot of mid-sized companies, you even have maybe a CFO that's running the IT shop, really doesn't understand a whole lot. So Overwatch takes a lot of that highly technical information and distills it into an enterprise-wide essentially suite that you can maintain compliance, because in the regulatory environment, as was mentioned before, it's only going to get more tough out there. You have these major breaches in the headlines, and now you have programs like the Cybersecurity Maturity Model certification coming out for defense contractors. You have expanded PCI DSS requirements and things like that. So managing compliance, vulnerabilities, and threats across the enterprise without having to rely on hands-on technicians all the time is going to be critical, and that's what this product essentially does.
Beautiful. Okay,
guys, we've run out of time here. So if anyone, I'd like to wrap it up now, but I want to give you guys a chance to say your final comments before we end, if any.
I mean, precautions for the future. I wish I had the crystal ball to really review this all over again, but we are where we are. And I think everyone has a new dynamic on how they're going to prepare for the next incident, whether it happens or not.
Yeah. Well, thank you all so much. I want to thank our panelists, absolutely, and our moderator, Peter. I think this was a very insightful webinar. We did get a little technical, but I think it's all very useful information, especially given, the majority of people transitioning to remote work, and we need to know how to protect ourselves and our sensitive data. So thank you guys so much. Again, I want to thank our sponsors, Baker Tilly, Ice Miller, NFP, BCMS, for their ongoing support. We have been doing a lot of these webinars. We're taking next week off, but we'll be back the following week. So we'll follow up with everyone with information on that. We'll be posting this webinar to our YouTube, so look out for that link. Thank you guys so much, and we'll be in touch. Everybody stay healthy and stay sane.
Thank you
for having us.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Pleasure.
David? Oh, okay.